Imagine being 19 years old, chained to a wooden block in a freezing stone cell, surrounded by soldiers who fantasize aloud about what they'd like to do to you before you burn. The girl who had commanded armies and crowned kings now sat in her own filth, iron shackles cutting into her ankles, while men who hated her watched her sleep, watched her eat, watched her relieve herself in a bucket they deliberately placed just out of comfortable reach. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the virgin warrior who had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War, was about to discover that dying in battle would have been mercy compared to what the English had planned for her. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her destroyed, humiliated, broken down until even God himself would turn away in disgust. And they had months to make it happen. When the Burgundians captured Joan at Compiègne on May 23, 1430, they knew they'd struck gold. The English were so desperate to get their hands on her that they paid 10,000 francs, the equivalent price of 1,000 war horses, just for the privilege of destroying her. By December, Joan found herself locked in the castle of Beauvais in Rouen, a fortress controlled by the Earl of Warwick, where the very stones seemed to sweat with English hatred. The room they kept her in was designed for maximum degradation. Medieval prisons were usually segregated by sex, with women guarded by nuns in church facilities, where at least the pretense of dignity was maintained. Not Joan. She was thrown into a military dungeon, a place where the worst criminals and prisoners of war rotted away, and she was given the special distinction of having 5 guards assigned to her at all times, 3 inside her cell, 2 outside, every moment of every day. They watched her dress, watched her undress, watched her crouch over that bucket in the corner, while they made comments that would make a seasoned soldier blush. The chains weren't just for security. They were a reminder that she was nothing now, just meat waiting for the fire. The psychological torture was exquisite in its cruelty. Joan had spent 2 years as a military commander, respected and even revered by soldiers who would have died for her. Now she was reduced to begging guards not to touch her, pleading for a chamber pot closer to her sleeping valet, asking permission to pray without being mocked. The guards were deliberately chosen from units that had been defeated by French forces, men who had personal reasons to hate her. They would lean against the walls of her cell, sharpening their knives while discussing in graphic detail what they thought should happen to a girl who dared to dress like a man and lead armies. One witness at the later rehabilitation trial testified that Joan lived in a constant state of terror, not of death, but of what might happen before death. The English had paid a fortune for her, and they intended to extract every ounce of political theater from her condemnation. But first, they had to break her spirit, and the best way to break a virgin warrior who claimed divine protection was to make her doubt that God was listening anymore. When she fell desperately ill with fever, so sick she thought she was dying, she begged to receive communion and to be buried in consecrated ground if she passed. The Earl of Warwick himself came to check on her, not out of concern for her soul, but because she couldn't be allowed to die before they de-squeezed every drop of propaganda value from her trial. Her requests for last rites were denied. Let her wonder if God had abandoned her. Let her lie in that cell, burning with fever, chains cutting into infected ankles, while guards laughed and told her that whores and heretics don't get Christian burials. The trial itself was a masterpiece of judicial corruption, dressed up in religious vestments. On January 3, 1431, Bishop Pierre Thune, a man so deep in English pockets he probably clinked when he walked, charged Joan with heresy. The proceedings began on February 21st in the castle chapel, where Joan, exhausted and malnourished, faced 42 clergymen whose verdict had been purchased before a single question was asked. They interrogated her for weeks before even formally reading the charges, a violation so blatant that even medieval legal standards would have rejected it. Joan was given no legal counsel, no advocate, no one to explain the theological traps being set for her. The questions were designed to destroy her no matter how she answered. When they asked if she believed herself to be in a state of grace, they thought they had her cornered. Church doctrine held that no one could know with certainty whether they possessed God's grace. Answer yes. Contradict church teaching. Answer no. Admit your visions were demonic. Joan, this uneducated peasant girl, responded with such theological precision that even her interrogators sat stunned. If I am not in grace, may God put me there. If I am in grace, may God keep me there. It was brilliant, unassailable, and it made them hate her even more. How dare this farm girl outmaneuver trained theologians? They redoubled their efforts to find something, anything, to condemn her with. The charges ballooned to 70 counts before being whittled down to 12 articles, focused obsessively on 3 things: her visions, her refusal to submit absolutely to church authority, and most tellingly, her insistence on wearing men's clothing. The clothing issue reveals the true depravity of Joan's imprisonment. The judges kept demanding to know why she refused to wear a dress, as if it were some perverse preference rather than a survival strategy. Joan explained repeatedly, with increasing desperation, that men's clothing, with its laces and bindings, offered protection that women's garments could not. She was surrounded by soldiers who hated her, locked in a cell with 3 men at all times, and she needed every defense she could manage. The court transcripts show her stating plainly that it was more proper to dress as a man when imprisoned among men than to wear women as clothing that left her vulnerable to assault. The judges dismissed this reasoning as absurd, but testimony from the 1456 rehabilitation trial tells a different story. Multiple witnesses stated that Joan had been the target of attempted rape, that a great English lord had tried to force himself on her, that guards regularly threatened her with violence if she didn't comply with their demands. One account describes her fighting off an assault attempt, screaming for help that never came, while guards outside her door laughed at her distress. The men's tunic and hose, laced tight from ankle to waist, were quite literally the only barrier between Joan and sexual violence. But the English clergy needed her to wear a dress because that would be evidence of her submission, her acceptance of the natural order they claimed she had violated by leading armies. It was never about modesty or biblical law. It was about control, about forcing her into vulnerability so she could be used and discarded like any other prisoner. As the trial dragged on, even some of the clergy began to feel uncomfortable. One tribunal member, horrified by the obvious manipulation of testimony, stepped down and stated publicly that the proceedings were designed to entrap Joan rather than seek truth. He was ignored. Another judge challenged Cauchon's authority to try the case at all, pointing out that it should have been held in Joan's home diocese, not in enemy-occupied territory. That judge was immediately arrested and imprisoned. The message was clear: question the verdict and join the heretic in chains. By May 23, 1431, exactly 1 year after her capture, Joan was informed that the University of Paris theologians had reviewed her case. Their verdict was as predetermined as everything else. Her voices were demonic. Her clothing was wicked. Her refusal to submit made her a relapsed heretic, deserving only death by fire. On May 24th, Joan was dragged to the cemetery of St. Ouen and forced to stand beside a prepared stake while a sermon was preached about the dangers of female pride. The sight of the wood, the smell of the pitch, the knowledge that this was real and immediate, finally broke her. After months of torture, isolation, and terror, the 19-year-old girl who had changed the course of history signed an abjuration, recanting her claims and admitting she had deceived France. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was ordered to wear women's clothing. She complied because what choice did she have? But compliance meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exactly what Joan had feared. Within days, Cauchon and his fellow judges visited Joan's cell to find her once again dressed in men's clothing. Joan claimed she had changed of her own will, that her saintly voices had reproached her for cowardice. But witnesses at the rehabilitation trial told a different story. They testified that guards had stolen Joan's dress during the night, leaving her naked except for the men's tunic and hose. When she woke and found herself with no other option, she was forced to put on the forbidden's clothing. Some accounts suggest this was no accident, that the dress was deliberately removed to manufacture evidence of relapse. Whether through coercion or desperation, Joan's return to male clothing sealed her fate. Under canon law, a relapsed heretic could not be given a second chance. On May 29th, the judges unanimously agreed she must be burned. The sentence was passed with the kind of relief you hear in the voices of men who know they're recommitting murder, but have successfully hidden it behind legal procedure. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was allowed to receive the Eucharist, a final mockery since heretics weren't supposed to receive the sacraments. Then she was led through the streets of Rouen to the Place du Vieux Marche, where a tall plaster pillar stood waiting in the center of a large crowd. The pillar was deliberately built high, so the flames would take longer to reach her, maximizing her suffering and ensuring the crowd got a good show. Joan asked for a cross as she was tied to the stake. An English soldier, moved by something, perhaps guilt, perhaps pity, took 2 sticks and lashed them together, giving her this crude symbol to clutch. She kissed it, held it against her chest, and then a processional crucifix was brought from a nearby church and held before her eyes as the executioners prepared the fire. Her hands were bound. The crowd pressed closer, and then the flames were lit. Eyewitnesses reported that Joan cried out repeatedly as the fire climbed the pyre, calling on God, calling on her saints, calling for Jesus. Her final word, shouted above the roar of burning wood and the screams of a dying girl, was Jesus. She was 19 years old. The executioners, following orders, burned her body twice more after death to ensure nothing remained, no bone fragment or scrap of cloth that could become a relic. Her ashes were shoveled into the Seine River, scattered in the current, erased from the earth. The English believed they had solved their Joan of Arc problem permanently. Instead, they had created a martyr whose story would haunt them for centuries. 25 years later, a rehabilitation trial heard testimony from 115 witnesses who described the corruption, the torture, the manufactured charges, and the deliberate manipulation that had condemned an innocent girl. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. The heretic burned by the English became the patron saint of France. But here is the thing they do and tell you in history class. Joan spent her final months in a hell designed specifically for her, watched constantly by men who wanted to break her body and spirit, denied even the basic dignity of privacy or safety, forced to choose between maintaining her protection and obeying the court that would kill her either way. The trial was never about heresy. It was about destroying a symbol, about punishing a girl who had dared to be extraordinary, about making sure that no other peasant would ever again believe that God might speak to them instead of to kings and bishops. They burned her alive because death wasn't enough. They needed her to suffer, to doubt, to recant, to die knowing that the men who claimed to represent God had decided she was worthless. And the truly horrifying part? It almost worked.